Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. And my name is Sam Baker. I am the co-founder and president of Wunder Mobility. We are a software and services company that helps companies and cities launch new mobility services. And today I'd like to talk to you about the future of mobility in cities with a special focus on the area of light electric vehicles. This is a really interesting area that I'd love to share some perspectives with you about. Earlier this year, in a very different world, I attended CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, and I heard perspectives from other audience members that had seen a new vehicle that was presented by Segway. It's this egg-shaped vehicle you can see on the right here, and these participants were making fun of the way that it looked. They said it's so goofy, nobody would ever want to ride in something like that. I can't really imagine that this will ever last. And this got me thinking of an earlier time in our history, only 100 years ago, when cars started appearing on the roads in European cities and North American cities, mainly initially, and they were met with a similar reaction. You know, there were people that said, "This is crazy. Why would you ride in an unsafe, weird-looking device that looks like this? This is only for people who are crazy." And this is, in fact, I think, a time in our history where light electric vehicles are viewed in a very similar light. They look funny. Why would someone use something like that? What could possibly be the utility? It's hard for us to imagine that it can become a very widespread and very common device that's used in our society, much in the same way that the automotive industry has really transformed the world we live in. And it's not just the fact that cars exists on the roads, but it's the fact that we have these roads that are designed for cars in the first place. It's the fact that we have parking spaces that fill huge, vast portions of urban space in cities. And one statistic I heard on this, the city of Los Angeles in California, something like 30% of the real estate in that city right now is taken up by parking spaces. And what would the world look like if we didn't have parking spaces for vehicles? What would it feel like to live in those types of cities and environments from an environmental standpoint, with the air that we breathe and the way that it smells and whatnot? So we are just at the beginning of what I believe is a transformation that we are not quite expecting, but that will be significant over the next few decades as it relates to light electric vehicles. My response to the individuals that were making this joke at CES was, I said, you know, maybe this particular design that looks like an egg that you're being transported around in might not be the final design or one of the most popular concepts in the future, but the framework of having someone have a personal mobility device that is electric powered, that is just for themselves or one other passenger, that can be easily parked in an urban space, that is environmentally friendly, that can be quickly charged. That is something that has, I believe, staying power in our society and has the ability to really impact the world that we live in and should be taken quite seriously. And by the numbers, let's look at the macro view of our world that we live in today. Something like 50% of the world's population are living in what we call megacities or dense urban environments. This has been a dramatic shift over the last 100 years. We have industrializations, folks moving to cities to get jobs and to really profit from the growth. At the same time, we see this growth accelerating over the next 30 years or so. In 2050, it's projected that 70% of the world's population will be urban. And this is a continuous transformation away from rural environments into urban cities. And of course, the question then becomes, when this occurs, what will happen to the space that we live in? And what will happen to the vehicles that we use to get around in cities? The idea of having a personal car that has 4 to 5 extra passenger seats in it for an individual person to be carried around cities will become obsolete, or at least not as common. It doesn't actually make sense to have a 1-ton vehicle that's rated for highway travel at speeds of 100 plus kilometers per hour when you are traveling much shorter distances at much lower speeds in dense urban environments. Even today, average speeds in places like London, Manila, or even in Los Angeles, as I've seen data about recently, we're talking about speeds that would be like biking. and in some cases even the same speed as walking. And so it's not physically possible for every human being, all 7 billion of us, and then soon to be more billions over the next 30 years, to actually have access to a private car that's taking up that much space, and not to mention, of course, the impacts on the environment for not only producing that vehicle, but also the petroleum that's needed in terms of the way that those vehicles are powered. So really not something that is practical for 7 billion people on our planet. Here's a really interesting overview of, we ask ourselves the question, but don't we need cars to get around cities? Well, actually, for many trips, it's not necessary to use a car, it appears. When we look at average commute distances, and I understand we have many audience members from Asia at the moment in particular. I use some examples from China. We look at average commute distances, a one-way trip 15 kilometers, round trip 30 kilometers for the top cities in China. This 30-kilometer is well within the range of an average light electric vehicle that is on the streets today, that you can purchase at a retailer for yourself, or you can use in a sharing service. Totally possible. Also, using a US example here, for our friends in North America, you can see that a large majority of trips in going to work every day for a commute, less than 10 miles here, it says about the same result as in the China example. So it's, in short, it's possible to use light electric vehicle for 1 passenger, 2 passengers that has a 50-kilometer range to get to work and to get home again, and with very limited disadvantages in that regard. So it's quite practical. But what about the pricing, right? So it's like, okay, that sounds like a good idea, better for the environment, more space, etc. You can get to work and back, but what about the price? Well, it turns out that in the world that we live in today, where the economy is not doing well at all, to put it mildly, and at the same time, space is becoming more precious. The price of buying a new Toyota vehicle, clearly, let's use an European example, something like 20,000 euros would be common. This equivalent moped that you see here, which is an electric-powered moped, this is actually a model that we sell at Wunder Mobility to our operators and also to retail outlets that then sell to end customers. This vehicle retails for approximately 2,000 euros, a little bit more than that. It's about a tenth of the cost. And so very, very accessible price point relative to the convenience of getting around, easy parking, very cost effective to fuel. It's like a battery that you can pull out, plug into your wall, just like you would plug in your iPhone to a socket in your home, or it can also be directly plugged into the wall itself, the vehicle. So this kind of price discrepancy is something that we're seeing with the emergence of lower cost electronics, lower cost batteries, that is really making it difficult to justify for daily trips why you would need a full passenger vehicle in most cases. The growth is significant, and the reason why we're seeing the light electric vehicles being sold at this pace is because, as I mentioned, cheaper vehicles, still practical and convenient, technology is improving. Some growth rates we look at here: 18% year-on-year growth in electric vehicles globally currently, and then on the right-hand side you can see here that we're looking at the growth rates for car sales, right? So North America, Japan, Europe, negative or single-digit percent, low single-digit percent, and in other markets that are considered to be the high growth markets for the automotive industry are still not so high growth relative to light electric vehicles, it seems. So less than 5% year on year, and projected that over the next 30 years that this will also continue to be adjusted downward as other transportation services become available, where you don't actually have to own a vehicle or purchase one from scratch. And when we think about right now the mix in cities, the majority of vehicles that we perceive in a city when we look around us are cars, right? This is besides maybe the occasional bus or the subway in some contexts, we see a lot of private vehicles on the road. And we have to imagine a future where instead of it being single-digit percent of light electric vehicles on our roads, which is every now and again we see an electric scooter. In some markets, in some cities, I understand, particularly in China, it's very common to own an electric scooter, but in many parts of the world, it's not. It's not it will not be like, okay, once in a while you see an electric scooter. It will be something like 30-40% of the vehicles in cities within the next 20 or 30 years will actually be light electric vehicles. And what's interesting is you can see right now how this actually numerically stacks up. Right now it's something like 1.5 billion passenger vehicles. Well, we anticipate that within the next 30 years that there will be 2 billion light electric vehicles on the roads in cities around the world, with a very moderate growth rate in cars by that point. So it's not unreasonable to expect that from less than 5% of vehicles on the road being light electric vehicles today, that could be 30-40% in the future. And then, of course, it's not possible to get to a presentation about our world and how it's changing without talking about the impact of COVID on our cities and the way that we get around. And certainly, COVID has had an impact on transportation, and specifically our relationship to ownership of vehicles. And in this case, an example of an operator in Germany that is providing electric scooters on a subscription basis. So this is a really interesting. We see that it's becoming less comfortable for individuals to use public transportation, particularly because of the fact that you're around a lot of other people in a very confined space, and there are concerns about health and the comfort related to that. And the alternative would be to have access to your own private vehicle, and instead of going out and buying it at a dealership, you might consider purchasing it on a subscription basis. So you get all the benefits of ownership in terms of it's always available for you. I can keep it at my house and use it when I need it. But at the same time, it's also not too expensive. And to put this into perspective, this scooter here costs 60 euros per month on a subscription. And in the city of Hamburg, where Wunder Mobility is based, it costs about 80 euros per month for a public transit pass. So our company provides employees with public transit passes. This is a part of the overall benefits of working. And so we as a company have to pay 80 euros to the Public Transit Authority, but we could alternatively provide a subscription for a personal scooter to an employee in theory for 60 euros per month. So in fact, it might even be cheaper than using public transportation for those individuals. So it's really, really cost competitive. And again, an alternative form of ownership that's really changing. It's not quite ownership, but it really does feel like that. And one thing to note, depending on where a city is in the COVID curve, if the city's in total lockdown and no one's allowed to go anywhere, of course, the usage of such services, either ownership or sharing services, will be extremely limited. I mean, we see in our own data, we provide sharing platforms for operators in over 100 cities now around the world, and we see that really the operators' overall activity rate just really collapse when cities go into lockdown, because there's no reason to be out, and in often cases it's prohibited to go out. So almost no activity on these sharing platforms. But then when the cities start to open up again, we have seen a dramatic increase in overall transactions back to pre-COVID rates. And we're really seeing that signs from demand coming in from operators that they are trying to ramp up their technology systems, trying to increase the number of vehicles that they have on the platform in anticipation, based on the data that they see when these cities have opened up, that the demand will be higher for personal mobility devices. And an example of this is a collaboration that Wunder Mobility has with a very large Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer, Yadea. We worked together with them to develop a sharing model of scooters that they've been commercializing successfully in China for years, and bringing those scooters that are now connected to cloud-based fleet management platforms that allow individual users to book a scooter with their mobile phones. Now these scooters can get connected to those platforms, and this is really a response to the demand that we've seen for sharing operators to say, okay, we would like to scale up our fleets. We're seeing the demand for this. We would like to diversify the form factors that we are providing for our end customers in terms of the types of vehicles that we can get access to at different price points and different types of styles. And so this is a part of the evolution that we are participating in as a company that originally was just focused on software, but now getting into understanding how we can add value into the hardware side of the equation and provide insights based on the learnings that we have with our own customers that manage fleets and understand like what is needed for how you design a vehicle that is going to be used by different people throughout the day, for different types of ways of moving around the city, how you can actually design a vehicle that is prepared to deal with that level of sharing. Even the sharing operators, though, have seen an increase in demand in addition to the sort of subscription-based light electric vehicle operators, because it seems that the public is perceiving even a shared operator having your own light electric vehicle as being slightly safer than potentially being in public transportation. So even if you're using a sharing scooter, it's considered a better and less risky form of transportation from a health perspective than using public transportation, at least from a consumer perception standpoint. And finally, I wanted to share a little bit more about the impacts on the environment and what cities may feel like when we are at a future where we have significantly less petroleum-based automotive vehicles on the road. And analogy that I think of here to put this into perspective is I remember a time in Germany, in North America, when I was traveling back and forth when I was younger, that it was still very common to be allowed to smoke indoors in restaurants and in public spaces such as airports. And so I would fly, for example, from Chicago to Munich, Germany, Chicago, USA to Munich, Germany. And when I landed in Germany, at the time in Germany, it was still allowed to smoke indoors, and in Chicago it was not allowed. And so the airport didn't smell like smoke in Chicago in the US, and it was a rather kind of clean air. And then when it landed in Munich, the very first thing that I remember getting off the plane was that it smelled like very heavy cigarette smoke, and that's the only thing that I couldn't get out of my mind. It's like, okay, I just arrived in Germany, everything's exciting, but it smells like cigarette smoke, and it was just such a shock because when you get used to not having cigarette smoke in confined spaces, then you get used to the feeling. And then when you are then exposed to that again, or at least in my case, when I was exposed to that again, then it made me feel sick because I just for months and months and months didn't have that experience. I think that in the future, we will feel similarly about air quality in cities in the way that we feel about people smoking cigarettes in indoor spaces in many parts of the world where that's no longer allowed. And it will be hard to imagine unless you have that extreme difference between one day feeling what it's like to have clean air and then going into a context where there isn't clean air. And so we have had a really interesting social and environmental experiment recently with COVID, in that we have had the ability to turn off vast quantities of air pollution in cities because people are not moving around. And we can see here on aerial photos the impacts of, in one case, this is an aerial view of China, and showing, okay, pre-COVID, same time period post-COVID, no one's going around cities, no one's using petroleum-based vehicles, significantly better air quality. Same in Italy, you can see here, northern Italy in the Milan area, dramatically better air quality during the time period of COVID. And then we get used to the feeling of what it's like to have less traffic on the roads, less crowded parking, less smelly even from pollution coming from vehicles. And I can imagine that if we have 30-40% penetration of light electric vehicles on the roads in cities in 2050, if that ultimately comes to be, that we will live in environments where significantly cleaner air, significantly more space, and if we are then traveling occasionally to areas that maybe have less electric vehicles or haven't progressed as far enough along, being able to introduce, let's say, cleaner forms of transportation, I think that it will be shocking, and we will say, wow, this feels weird, this feels uncomfortable. Maybe some final words to mention about the social impacts beyond the environment. We are Well, first, one more point on the environmental impacts. It was pointed out to me recently that producing light electric vehicles is, of course, in and of itself environmentally intensive, and then recuperating parts or recycling parts from vehicles, whether it be batteries or other components, is also has an environmental tax associated with it. One thing to point out is scooters and light electric vehicles, more broadly speaking, particularly in Western markets, were introduced really heavily in the last years because of the emergence of sharing platforms like Bird and Lime, to name a few, and have really popularized or made apparent the use of electric vehicles. And they created a reputation initially for having vehicles that have very short lifespans. Like, okay, usually you use the scooter for 2 months and then you have to throw it away. The reason why, and the data that I've seen suggests that that is in fact the case, that early scooters had very short lifespans. What has happened though in the meantime, and you have to understand, in the beginning, the companies were using consumer scooters that were designed for retail markets. So these would be scooters that would be sold in a store for an end user that would use it once or twice a day at the most. And then they were using them in sharing contexts that were essentially renting the scooters for maybe 6-7 times a day on average. And so, of course, through that sort of wear and tear and being in public spaces and not being able to sort of take the scooters home and really protect them, the scooters were damaged really easily and in often cases broke. So with subsequent generations of scooters, and bear in mind here that a generation of scooters can be every 3 months, that the electric vehicle companies are coming out with the iterations of new designs and new technology, much similar to the sort of production cycles and the innovation cycles of the consumer electronics industry, much more closely aligned with consumer electronics than it is with automotive, which is about every 5-year cycles for new innovations in vehicles. With every new generation we've seen come out in the past few years, there's been an increasing lifetime and lifetime value for those vehicles. So now averages that we see in operations that we power are well over a year in terms of the lifetime of a particular light electric vehicle. Not where we would like it to be long term, not as sustainable as it could be, but definitely moving in the right direction in terms of the trajectory of improvements. And then a second thing to note about all the social impacts, innovation cycles between the automotive industry and light electric vehicles, with automotive being 5-year cycles and light electric vehicles being several months. I honestly believe that there will be parts of the world and economies that are principally dependent on the automotive industry will be severely impacted by these types of innovations. So it's very unlikely that that the next big light electric vehicle company that has massive market share around the world will be a brand that we know that is an automotive company. It's not likely to be that Ford has the next sort of big bike that everyone's riding around cities, or that BMW has the killer scooter that everybody wants to have. It's much more likely, in my opinion, that it will be a company that is maybe a combination of a partner that is an electronics manufacturer and that makes great consumer electronics, and then maybe a software company that provides a great software user experience, and then a manufacturer that is maybe on a tier 1 supplier for an automotive company that brings this sort of experience about how one scales up manufacturing for vehicles, but not necessarily one company that does the end-to-end design and manufacturing all in one house, and likely not a car company, because the processes and the cycles for innovation, design, the type of mentality and thinking, the intersection points between software and hardware, which have to be super precise, will be very difficult for a traditional automotive model. Consequently, countries like Germany, 25% of the German economy is based on or directly related to the automotive industry. Japan has similar levels of impact. So I would anticipate that as we shift more and more trips in cities to light electric vehicles, to transit services, where overall car sales go down globally in the next 30 years, that there will be the need to redeploy human capital and financial capital in other areas in order to compensate for some of the social impacts of less demand in those areas. Those are my thoughts about the future of light electric vehicles in cities and some of the exciting and disruptive things that can be happening. There's some of the challenges as well that we will be facing. I hope that you were able to take something out of the conversation today that's helpful for you. And I would love to stay in contact, answer any questions that you have. Feel free to reach out to me at Sam Baker on LinkedIn, or send me an email here at my email address. I'd love to continue the conversation with you. I'd love to understand if there's any way that I can be helpful. And in the meantime, I hope you have a safe and wonderful day. Thank you.